hero I want to talk about is Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. And let me start by, the name of my book is Pale Blue Light. I'm going to read a poem that was found on the body of a dead Confederate after First Bull Run. His name was John Williams Parker. We see him now, the old slouched hat cocked o'er his eye askew, the shrewd, dry smile, the speech so pat, so calm, so blunt, so true. The blue light elder knows him well, says he, that's Banks, he's fond of shell. Lord save his soul, we'll give him hell. That's Stonewall Jackson's way. Silence, ground arms, kneel all, caps off, old blue lights going to pray. Strangle the fool that dares to scoff. Attention, it's his way. Appealing from his native sod, hear us, Almighty God. Lay bare thine arms, stretch forth thy rod. That's Stonewall Jackson's way. John Williamson Parker, dead at Bull Run. It's an interesting thing to me. The South named their battles after the nearest stream, and the North after the nearest town. So you'll see often different names for the same battle. And the Yankees didn't know much. It was Bull Stream. There was a creek, a stream named Bull, the Bull, and they called them runs. So it was Bull Run. That was the first battle, and that's where we'll start. This isn't your daddy's history book. It's authentic history, fact, T's crossed, I's dotted for all the battles. And the first half of the book is mostly about Stonewall Jackson and how he got to know my protagonist, Ray Buchanan. And Jackson was, it's been called narrative fiction, it's been called alternative history, but what it is, it's an espionage spy story, and it's set within the Civil War. It's not about the war per se. It doesn't go into the causes, it doesn't go into all the other things. It's a spy story. And one of my favorite reviews said, I like this hero, Ray Buchanan, from the start, but I didn't know he was going to turn into James Bond. He kind of does, and I'll tell you why. Jackson and Ray Buchanan, my hero, come to be friends before the war. They meet because they're turkey hunters of all things. But also, it's narrative history, but it's historically accurate up to Jackson's death. And I got bound newspapers from Time Life, newspapers from the period. So the actual quotes in there. The Civil War, the war between the states, or as I like to call it, the recent unpleasantness. So we're going to try to humanize the mythic figure of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was one of the most determined men of history. His motto was, you can be anything that you resolve to be. He was the tactical genius to Lee's strategic genius. And when the two fought together, they never lost a battle the whole time up till Jackson died. And I'm going to talk to you about the first battle where he won his fame and his nom de guerre, Stonewall, and his last battle. And he died at the height of his genius. And that's pretty much a life well lived. So after Gettysburg, well, George McClellan, the Union general, said, I can whip Jackson, I can whip Lee, but fighting them together is an entirely different proposition. So they never lost a battle. Stonewall Jackson died while they were still winning the war, as a matter of fact. Where grievous tactical errors were made at Gettysburg, and Lee said that his death, that had Jackson been there, they would not have failed to take the high ground. They would have not made some of the charges they made. So, but genius has its vagaries. Jackson was a vegetarian. He thought his left leg was shorter than his right leg, though it wasn't. He often rode with his left hand in the air. You see paintings and portrait pictures, because photography was actually born during the Civil War. He had his left finger pointing to heaven, and people thought he was praying, which he was. He was devout. He was a devout Christian, and truly so. But actually, he thought riding with his left hand up balanced his internal organs. He thought his internal organs were shifty, and he didn't trust his internal organs. And that's why y'all probably know he ate lemons all the time. He thought the acidic properties of the fruit aided his digestion. When he started, and he thought if he inadvertently ate pepper, it made his left leg go numb. So like I said, genius has its vagaries sometimes. He was, as you know, he fought well in the Mexican War. He and Lee were distinguished. And Jackson thought his military career was over. He went back to Virginia Military Institute, as y'all probably know. He was a professor of artillery and philosophy and astronomy. And he was not beloved. Jackson was as taciturn and as strict a taskmaster as a professor as he was as a soldier. And he was not in favor by the many of the guys, but that same determination and iron will saved him and men many, many times. When he started to train his men, when he was made major in the Confederate Army, he'd march them 10 miles one way, turn them around, march them 10 miles the other way, and they called him Tom Fool. That was one of his nicknames besides Pale Blue Light, was Tom Fool. But what he was doing was he was inventing the lightning strike that caused his men to be called Jackson's Foot Cavalry. And when his second Bull Run, when they fell upon Pope, I think it was, when they didn't think Jackson was in 50 miles, one of the guys he captured said, "What is it to you, Stonewall down Jackson, and does his men have wheels or wings?" So I guess y'all all know how he earned his name, but I love to tell the story. It was the first battle. It was July, I think. And McClellan, with about 50,000 men, had marched 3 or 4 days from Washington to Manassas. And Manassas Crossroad, it was named after a store there, and the owner was named Manassas, so they called it Manassas. And that was before nobody was in fighting condition, and men would fall out and go drink water and straggle. And it actually took 3 or 4 days for them to line up. The Confederates were dug in there, and at the bottom of Henry House Hill is what it was called. And McClellan did a brilliant maneuver. He feinted twice at the Confederate center and bunched it. But the real attack came from the flank, and he commenced to do what is called rolling up the line. The brunt of his force was hitting the side of the Confederates. It was an army picking them off one by one by one by one, kind of. And Confederate troops, nobody could take that. So they broke, and they started to retreat up Henry House Hill. And McClellan actually sent a telegram to Lincoln, said, "The day is ours." And apparently it was. But here's what happened. Oh, and also, both sides thought it was going to be a one-battle war. The North thought, we'll sweep them out of the way. The South thought, one rebel's worth 10 Yankees, we'll sweep them out of the way. So they all thought it was going to be a one-battle war. It was going to be kind of a picnic. And in fact, a lot of the hoi polloi from Washington, in their finery, Sunday finery, drove out in carriages, had picnic stuff, and to watch this fun battle, what they saw was horror. What they heard was the wet slap of bullets hitting men, the screams of dying horses, and men calling for their mother, calling for aid. And as the day progressed, as the Union Army struggled up the hill chasing the Confederates, they began to tire. They were carrying those heavy muskets they had on their uniforms. And of course the Confederates were tired too, but they were fleeing and they had a lot of adrenaline going. And at the top of the hill, General Bernard B. from South Carolina, in charge of Alabama troops actually, was trying to stop them. And he was saying, "You've got to stand, you've got to hold." And he couldn't stop them. And about that time, Jackson and his cadets from VMI came out of the woods. And B said to him, "They are beating us back." And Jackson said, "Then we will give them the bayonet." He had a predilection for cold steel. And Jackson may have said something like this to his men: "We are losing the war here in front of us today. We are losing the war, and it's up to you to stand and die if you need to. Stand and die, but stand." And they stood, and they started pushing back the Union forces. And of course, Bernard B. said, "Look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally to the Virginians." And they did. They rallied. The retreat stopped, and they turned the tables and started chasing the Union forces back down the hill. And McClellan still wasn't worried. He thought they still had the day won. And this is actual. All of it's actual, but this is something a lot of people don't know. The Black Horse Cavalry, there's still a Black Horse Cavalry, it's helicopters now, but the Black Horse Cavalry was a Confederate brigade of 600 horses, black horses, coal black horses, ridden by planters' sons, mostly, a lot of them lawyers, and they were born to the saddle. It took 2 years for the Union to even come anywhere close to Southern cavalry. One of the commanders said they're jockeys on circus horses because they were so good. And the Black Horse asked no quarter and gave no quarter. It had been in 2 pretty heavy skirmishes and had slaughtered the opposition without regard, and had a very mean reputation that was well deserved. And this is what the New York Times said: "The Union Army was retreating in good order until the rumor swept through them that the Black Horse Cavalry was riding down upon them, and for all intents and purposes, the Union Army fell apart." So they began to retreat and did not count on their going. And then what happened? Bull Run was not wide, but it was deep. And there was one bridge over Bull Run, and the Confederate gunner made the shot of the day. He landed a shell right in the middle of the bridge, blew up a horse and a carriage, and blocked the only egress from the battlefield. And when that happened, the Union soldiers truly panicked, and they threw down their weapons and they got across anywhere they could. And here's what happened to those swells from Washington that rode their fine buggies out. The Union soldiers ran over there and took their carriages and horses away from them and rode back to Washington on them and left the hoi polloi stranded. And it took 8, 20, 30 hours for the Union soldiers to make the same trip back to Washington. It took them 3 days to get there. But Jackson said, and here's another thing: the gunpowder of the day was very greasy, very thick, and you will see photographs or paintings. There's always a pall of black smoke over the battlefield, thick. And actually, that's where rainmakers learned their art, was to create a cloud. And so it brought rain often, and it did at Bull Run, first Bull Run. And men were tired, and there was terrible conditions. It was night, and Jackson met with Jefferson Davis and with Beauregard, who was the commander then, and said, I don't care if it kills me and half our men. We have to take Washington City tonight. We might never have another chance. And they said no. So Jackson was very prophetic in that. But after his marvelous stance on top of Henry House Hill, he was made a lieutenant general, and he was given command of the Shenandoah Valley. And that's where he had 20,000 soldiers to the Shenandoah Valley, and he was invincible. In 6 weeks, he defeated 3 different Union armies, usually outnumbered and sometimes as much as 2 to 1. He captured almost 20,000 Union soldiers, more than any other Americans, until Bataan fell. His honor, his glory, his fame was worldwide. He was the new Napoleon, and he was regarded well, not only by his troops, but by Union troops, who would often, if they knew he was in the vicinity, give cheers for Stonewall Jackson. They respected him that much. The New York Times, when Jackson died, ran an editorial cartoon that showed Jackson approaching Heaven's Gates and the devil trying to block him, and Jackson flanking the devil and coming in, St. Peter helping him in from the side. As I said, and he didn't look. Jackson wanted to be part of his men. He was very strict, but he did not look the part of the fancy general. He insisted the uniforms be as tidy as they could be, but they were tattered. And his uniform was tattered, and he wore the kepi, the slouch hat. He didn't go in for braid and all that kind of stuff much. And he was honestly devout, so he was well regarded by all and sundry. Let's go on to 1863. Chancellorsville. That was the height of Jackson's genius displayed. It was also the night he died. General Fighting Joe Hooker was brash and bold. So many Union generals had been cashiered because they failed. McClellan, Pope, Burnside, they failed so often. They were cashiered so many it began to look like a Costco checkout line. They were cashiered. But Joe Hooker, he'd been in the Western Theater fighting Indians, and of course the Eastern Theater was where all this was taking place. So they brought him to command the Union Army. He'd done well in the Western Theater, and he didn't lack confidence. In April 1863, he marched his army of 100,000 out of Washington with these words to the press: "May God have mercy on General Lee, for I shall have none. All I want is my army in front of his." Watch what you pray for, man. Hooker's plan was rather simple. He knew Lee had wintered in Fredericksburg, so he determined to march his men west through the wilderness and surprise Lee and Jackson. He would come out between the rebel army and Richmond, encounter Lee's army from the flank and rear, whip him, capture Richmond, and get elected president. So that was a simple thing to him. That was his plan. Can you imagine him thinking he could blunder 100,000 men through thick woods and Lee and Jackson be unaware of it? The morning of April 29, 1863, he emerged from the wilderness and intended to fall on Lee and Jackson from the flank and rear. And when he emerged from the wilderness, Jackson fell upon him from the flank and rear and mauled him severely. And like others before him, he retreated and dug in. The next morning found him where others facing Lee and Jackson found themselves, dug in and waiting to see what Lee would do. He famously said, "If General Lee will let me alone, I will surely let him alone." And he later admitted, "I just lost faith in Joe Hooker." One little bomo about Hooker, he was a pretty serious womanizer. And the camp followers, the women of, shall we say, Soel Dove's ill repute, a lot of them followed his army, and they came to be called Hooker's women. And then they came to be called hookers. So he did leave something for history. He had 100,000 soldiers. Lee had 45,000. And he left a good contingent in Fredericksburg to guard that place. May 3rd dawned cool and clear. The armies facing each other, and one wishing it were somewhere else. Hooker knew he had intelligence. He knew Lee's army was nowhere near the strength of his own, and he couldn't imagine that Lee would actually attack him. But when he got up that morning, he saw Lee in full battle array, spoiling for action. He'd seen another thing Hooker had. General O.O. Howard's 11th Corps was the vanguard. It was in the middle of his defensive position. The 11th Corps had a couple of skirmishes and had not acquitted itself well. It didn't do badly, so to speak, but it had a kind of a spotty record. And he moved the 11th Corps from the center of his defense to his right flank, which was up in the air, by the way, but unsupported. A serious no-no. But around 4 o'clock, things happened. Lee and Jackson were discussing battle plans when a young man from the area gave information that he knew a logging road that would flank Hooker's right flank. He said he didn't know much about military operations, but he knew enough to know that Hooker's right flank was unsupported. So Lee said to Jackson something like, "Thomas, what do you think about this situation with the logging road, flanking Hooker's flank?" And Thomas said, "I think I ought to take my men and go down there and see about it." And Lee said, "How many will you take?" And he said, "I'll take my army, 30,000 men." That left Lee with maybe 20,000 right in front of Hooker's 100,000. And Lee said, General Hooker has also done us a marvelous favor. He's moved the 11th Corps from the center of their defenses, and he's neglected to plug that hole. Hooker had divided his own army. And Lee said, Jackson sent word back, said, "I'm in position. What are you going to do?" Lee said, "I'm going to whale into him." And that's what he did. Lee drove right through that gap and straight toward Hooker's headquarters. Jackson, the 11th Corps, in the meantime, thought that they were well out of it. It was late. They'd already begun making their dinners, playing banjo, writing letters home, telling lies, whatever armies do. And all of a sudden, deer and foxes and other animals, rabbits, started running through their campsite. And they were bemused and amused. They didn't know what was going on. And then they found out, because up on the ridge, in a line 1 mile wide, the Stonewall Army fell on them like a nightmare. It's just like maybe somebody knocking at your door, you open the door, and Mike Tyson punches you right in the nose. The 11th Corps did what anybody would do. They ran, had to. It's either that or be slaughtered. So, and to their credit, they did form later on. But in the meantime, Hooker heard firing to his right, and he thought Jackson was retreating to Richmond. And he heard firing in front of him, and he thought they were beating up on Lee. When blue-coated soldiers started running past the Chancellor House, and they couldn't figure it out. Finally, one of his aides went out and he grabbed the soldier. He said, "Soldier, why are you running?" And he said, "Because I can't fly." He said, "The Stonewall Army is behind me. Stonewall Jackson and his entire army are right behind me. And if you got any sense, you'll run too." So Booker said, "I think we better move." So it became weird. The night fell, and it became like something out of Macbeth. It was the battle. It was a movement night, but the smoke from the battlefield had covered the whole wilderness, and it was dark, and weird things happened. Two Union platoons ran into each other in the dark and fought savagely for nearly 20 minutes. Sentries, messengers who were supposed to deliver communications, two of them stood within 50 yards of each other for nearly an hour before they discovered each other. So the only reason Pope's entire army wasn't captured is 30,000 men can't capture 100,000 men. It just can't be done. And it was night. Pockets of Union soldiers formed in the woods, and it was no man's land. The fighting became sporadic, the firing slowed, then stopped, and Jackson began to saddle up. And his men said, "What are you doing?" And Jackson said, "I'm going to reconnoiter." He was planning to make the first midnight attack in the history of major warfare. And his men said, "No, General, you cannot do that. There's danger everywhere." And Jackson said, he believed in predestiny. He said, "The time, manner of my death has been long established, and I'm not afraid." Well, yeah, but he should go ahead and invite things. Also, he rode out with his men in one direction, made a loop, and came back from another direction. He passed the 113th New York, which heard horses beat up, the hooves. And they knew it wasn't their guy, so they opened fire. They didn't hit anybody in Jackson's outfit, but they claimed they'd kill Jackson. In a way they did, because what they did, they caused Jackson and his men to break into a gallop toward their lines. And as they approached the lines, y'all probably know, they were fired upon by the pickets. And Jackson was stunned. None of them were hit. But one of Jackson's men yelled, "You are cease fire. You are shooting at your own men." And Colonel John Barry, who was in charge of pickets, yelled, and nobody knows why, said, "It's a damn lie. It's a Yankee trick. Fire and continue to fire." The second volley broke out, and this was killed people. Jackson was hit 3 times. Grazed his right arm, grazed his left forearm, and the 67 caliber bullet, all musket ball, broke his arm and almost detached it from his shoulder. And he, of course, and his horse ran away. Little Sorrel was his name. His real name of the horse was Fancy, but he called it Little Sorrel, so everybody did. Bolted, and Jackson actually hit a branch in his forehead and knocked him from the horse. And he was being stretchered from the field. And then artillery landed near them, and the men dropped him. And Jackson said, "Run, save yourselves, let me die." And they said, "No, we are not going to be the ones who leave Stonewall Jackson to die." So they got him off the field. But things had gone sour. The word spread. Jackson said, "Don't let anybody know who is wounded." But the word spread, and I think Jeb Stuart took over, but by that time everybody was demoralized, and the night was so creepy. So Jackson was taken to a farmhouse. And the thing is, he was healing. His wound was healing. But he was so weakened that he contracted pneumonia. And 10 days later, Jackson was delirious as the fever took him. His wife was there by his side, and she told him, you know, Thomas, you're dying. And he said, surely not, surely not. And then the doctor said, yes, you don't have much longer. And so Jackson said, and Lee sent him a telegram that said, you have lost your left arm, but I have lost my right. Jackson should have recovered from the wound, but developed pneumonia. He died May 10th, 3:15 p.m. And moments before he died, delirious, he called out for General A.P. Hill to move up, but left the sentence unfinished. An eyewitness said a smile of ineffable sweetness spread over his pale face, and he said quietly, with an expression of relief, let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of those trees. 6 weeks later, and so he did cross over the river. 6 weeks later, without his tactical genius, the South lost at Gettysburg. In 1881, in Metairie, Louisiana, a statue of Stonewall Jackson was erected. The aging chaplain of the Louisiana Tigers prayed, and when, O Lord, in thy inscrutable wisdom, it was decreed the Confederacy must fail, it became necessary for thee to remove thy servant, Stonewall Jackson. That's the first half of my book, right up to the point of Jackson's death. And here's the thing. There is more, to me, there's significant evidence that it could have been a plot, an assassination, and a Confederate plot, because Jackson was not loved by some of the men around him and above him. So here's the thing. Here are these riders coming up toward you, and the pickets fired, and the riders stopped, and a conversation started. Stop, you're shooting your own men. What should have been the next thing? Identify yourselves. But no, Barry says fire and continue to fire. So that contributed to the death of Stonewall Jackson. Some places it's told differently, but that's the way. I've read 50, 60 books about Jackson, and that is what I hang this slender thread that it possibly could have been an assassination. But in my book, my protagonist, Rabe Cannon, who is quite something himself, determines that it was a ploy, and he goes after whom he thinks is responsible. So let me tell you, that's just the first half of the book. I'm going to read you a review by Don Noble. This was published, it was part of PBS. Pale Blue Light is a Civil War novel, sure enough. It is also an action-adventure novel, a murder mystery with a protagonist as detective, an espionage, counter-espionage novel, a romance novel with a dash of healthy eroticism, and two genuine sexual perverts, a masochist and a sadist, and a travel narrative with the characters rounding Cape Horn in a clipper ship and then in the manner of Jules Verne, crossing America in a balloon. It's a novel of the cavalry and cowboys and Indian story and an alternative histories novel. Rabe Cannon, the protagonist, is as he needs to be, a kind of superhero, 6 feet 7 inches tall, physically powerful, of course, a master with his twin pistols made by Krupp in Germany, especially for him, 50 caliber, not 45, 7 rounds, not 6. He is also ferociously adept with his cavalry saber and can throw a knife with unerring accuracy. He's also ambidextrous, just like Nathan Bedford Forrest was. Cannon will go on a secret mission. and try to rescue a damsel in distress. In this first novel, nothing is omitted. A superhero needs a super horse, and Rabe has one. Hammer is coal black, the largest horse anyone has ever seen. 18 hands at the withers and of great intelligence. At the touch of a number or signal, Hammer will prance, rear back, or paw the ground, counting. He will drop to the ground to hide or act as a shield for his master. He's been taught code words. He will do tricks, more tricks than a dog act on the old Ed Sullivan show. So, Rabe also has spiritual prowess, some occasional prophetic visions, and meaningful dreams. No matter how over the top this novel is, there's no denying its energy and pace. We move through exciting crises and cliffhangers like a Saturday afternoon serial. Cannon believes Jackson was murdered, and there's a conspiracy, and he will get to the bottom of it, and readers will stick with him until he does. Don't miss this book. Pale Blue Light is an extraordinary book, one you might miss because it has been released by a small publisher. It's hard to classify, not strictly history, more of the Truman Capote in cold blood genre, a highly accurate recreation, a puzzling and tantalizing premise, a what if about a well-known general's death. I think this book has been overlooked by readers who have not had access to it, but it is one of the most enjoyable books I've read in a long time. It's a work of historical fiction set during Stonewall Jackson's Civil War years. The characters, some known or even to the most cursory Civil War enthusiast, are so beautifully developed and alive they seem to leap from the page. The history is meticulously recreated, detailed, and accurate as painstaking can be. But history only accounts for the first 8 chapters. After that, it gets really exciting. Even the language has been carefully drawn to honor the time period and yet be accessible to the modern reader. This novel is masterfully written, a jewel of a book. If you are a Civil War history buff, go out and buy this book now. You'll thank me tomorrow. I'm not a Civil War reader, and it didn't make one bit of difference. This book is vibrant prose, one of the most vividly written, exciting thrillers I've ever read. There's something for everyone in this book. Mystery, war, madness, passion, romance, revenge, blood, sex, everything. I simply could not put this book down. I finished it in 2 days and I wanted to cry when it was over. I could almost cry now for my presentation's over, but I thank you so much again for having me here. I do have books, $20 for the paperback, $25 for the hardback. Thank you so much for allowing me to come, and I will take any questions.
How long after the war is this investigation supposed to take place?
It's during
the last couple of years?
Cannon is wounded at the same time Jackson is wounded.
Was he in the group that was Jackson?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And so while he's recovering, he puts together, he deduces, and he goes to higher ups to tell them, and they say, go get the guys, but don't tell anybody, because it'd be too demoralizing for the South to know it was an assassination. So it's all of a piece.
So he works on that all the way through the end of the war and then beyond before he figures it, or what?
It's toward the end of the war.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
How many men did Jackson take on that reconnoiter with him?
I think it was a 20-25. I'm not sure. I meant to look that up, again to make sure. But it was his aides de camp, so to speak. Anyone else? Thank you so much for having me. I've gone over my allotted time, and I apologize for that, but hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.